Okay, so in this next chapter, well, what we previously talked about was fiscal policy. So now, before we actually get right into monetary policy, which you would kind of think is the next step, what we need to talk a little bit more about is like what is money and what is the central bank. So the central bank in the United States is more popularly known as the Federal Reserve, which you've probably heard of. And the key thing that the central bank does is it creates money. And that's what we're going to learn about in this chapter. Okay, so if the central bank in the economy is in charge of making the money, this is what we see here, is that the money supply itself, or the monetary base, has grown, and it's grown significantly since the 2008-2009 crisis. We shouldn't be too surprised by this, but this is the thing that's most concerning to economists, because when this goes up this significantly, there has to be inflation, meaning that the money becomes less valuable because there's so much more of it. So while we see this steady increase since 84, what's more concerning is this dramatic increase right there. Why did we do that? Because the way that you help fix the economy is by massively stimulating it. Not only is the central bank making money, but also it's one of the role of banks and of just the act of lending and borrowing money that creates money in the system. So the money creation process depends not only on the central bank actually printing the cash, but also the banks making loans and people borrowing money. And we're going to learn how that actually creates even more money. So to do that, we need to talk a little bit about what the balance sheet looks like for a bank. The deposits that we make in cash to the bank, that's an asset. But even though it is an asset in the sense that they initially are accepting cash, it's also a liability for them. Because right now you have a legal claim to say to that bank, I deposited $500 with you. You have to pay me $500 when I ask for it. Right? That's a liability for them. The asset is they have the $500 in cash in their vaults, presumably. At least in the beginning. At least in the beginning, I say that because what we hope in the way that the bank makes money and exists as a business is that it makes loans. And it makes loans with that $500 that you deposited. So even though on their liability side, they're still going to have this deposit, essentially what's happening here is that the asset is changing from the deposited cash to taking the form of a loan. That's what the asset is doing. The asset's changing from the cash that I had deposited to a loan. And these two still have to offset each other. Liabilities still have to equal assets. Well, liabilities and shareholder equity. Now, banks are required to keep a certain minimum. That certain minimum is called the reserve ratio. So of their total deposits, they have to keep a certain minimum amount. Usually here in the United States, that amount is about 10%. So if I deposited $500, they would only have to hold $50. That minimum amount is called the reserve requirement. And again, most big banks, it's about 10%. The fact that it's not 100% is what makes it a fractional reserve banking system. In fact, there is no banking system in the world today that is a full 100% reserve banking system. All banks in the world operate on a fractional reserve banking system. It's up to the Federal Reserve Bank to make sure that the banks that are operating in this system are good businesses that are not wasting money and putting the whole system at risk, because there is only a fraction of the deposits held. So if enough of the loans go bad, as they would have during the housing crisis, it can cause a bank to fail because it doesn't have enough assets to offset, or it has too many liabilities and not enough assets to offset those liabilities, meaning they don't have enough loans, paid off loans, to offset all those deposits that were made. So in that money creation process, then, the banks are making money by lending out their excess reserves. This would be the money, the reserves that exceed the reserve requirement. Please be careful, Truman. What that then means is that as the banks are lending out money to people, people then spend that money. And when they spend that money, it's deposited by someone else, and then it's lent out again. And you get then the idea of how the money creation process works, is that the money is continually being lent out. What it creates for us is a money multiplier. And what that money multiplier does is it basically says, okay, what's your reserve requirement? Let's notate it as a whole number. In this case, let's say that 10% reserve requirement then is equal to 0.1. Then 1 over 0.1 is equal to 10. That's my money multiplier. Meaning that if I have a 10% required reserve ratio, that for every dollar that the Federal Reserve creates, that the money supply increases by a factor of 10. So basically, the central bank then only has to do 1/10 of the work, right? Of this $10 that's being created, being multiplied, $1 came from the Federal Reserve initially printing the cash. The other 10 would come from, or the other 9, I'm sorry, would come from the fractional reserve banking system. Oh, God. There's an error on this slide, an egregious error. This person would have gotten this wrong in my class. The government has nothing to do with the money supply when the central bank expands the money supply. It's doing it by adding the reserves electronically. The banks are making these loans based on the excess reserves, and that expansion process here, the way that it's working out then is it's helping the economy grow. And you want the economy to grow again when you're in that recessionary gap, right? The recessionary gap looking like, here's my long run aggregate supply curve, here's my short run aggregate supply curve. But we're saying that the aggregate demand curve, they intersect at a point to the, be careful, Truman, don't do that, okay? Back up to the left of the long run curve. I gotta email the publisher. That was a bad mistake. Now, even though we calculated the money multiplier to be 10, we actually most of the time don't see it to be that large, and that's because of leakages. And there's two sources of that leakage. The first would be is that banks don't lend out all that they are legally able to. Usually banks hold some excess reserves. Also, individuals often don't deposit all of their cash. They usually keep some cash on the side just to be, to have some spending money. So those two things then that mean that for every dollar that the Federal Reserve creates, you might not get the full $10 change because, again, two sources here would be people hold some cash, and that banks hold some excess reserves. Now, this slide here basically then describes the housing crisis. Is that many banks, most banks, had some solvency issues. Solvency meaning they didn't have enough cash to pay their immediate obligations. And it happened because individual borrowers were not paying off the loans that they had made. They weren't making regular payments. So then the bank is losing the asset, but the people who made deposits, that liability still remains. So now my assets are not sufficient to cover my liabilities. And so then you've got one or two options. Either the bank held some extra money. Okay, well, you're not eating cookies, but you can have some more. He's actually eating crackers. Probably not better, but he's not eating cookies. Just wait a little bit, okay, Truman?
Okay, let's go singing.
Yeah, let's not sing right now, okay? I've already said this. Banks don't lend out all the money that they can, so this is reducing the money multiplier because they're not lending out all their excess reserves. So that reduces the money supply size. And we've already talked about, so this was the leakage source. If we're going back on that previous numbering system, that was my leakage source number 2. Banks not lending out all their money. This was my leakage source number 1, the fact that people hold some of their money as cash. Now, in the case of the U.S., this problem is actually a little bit even more pronounced because the U.S. dollar is actually the world's most popular currency, and people hold that cash just because they want a safe currency to hold. And so that reduces the money multiplier for the U.S. dollar specifically a little bit more. It would be the same with the Swiss franc as well, which is another currency that lots of people who are scared of the end of the world tend to hold. So then what economists tend to do is they tend to adjust the money multiplier for all these leakages. So this would be something less than the 1 over the reserve ratio. That it would be something less than whatever that ratio is. So again, if the required reserve ratio was 10%, or let's just make it 25%. If it was 25%, my money multiplier theoretically would be 4, but we're saying the leakage adjusted money multiplier would be something less than 4. How's it look in reality? Well, it actually went to less than 1, which is pretty significant and tells you how severe that recession was. Yeah, don't fall. Sit down, buddy. Was less than 1. That's significant because essentially what this means is the sub-bullet point identifies here is that for every dollar introduced into the money supply by the central bank, be careful. Be careful. You have to be careful. You could hurt yourself. Be careful, please. For every dollar created by the central bank, in the case of this recession here, it actually turned out to be that the money supply increased by less than 1 because people were holding so much cash and because the leakages in terms of excess reserves was so high. Okay, let me pause the video here, or stop the video here, and then I'll create part 2.